morning, good evening, wherever you are from. They are joining us today from different parts of the world, which is a very good sign and a sign of the global nature of raptor conservation. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of this report, the Raptor Introduction and Reinforcement Program, Experience from the Field. Let me share my screen as well, so you can also see the present. So raptors, as you know, are include eagles, vultures, falcon, kites, and so on. And they are not only spectacular animals, they are also very important ecological indicators. Their presence, or their absence, in fact, tell us something about the health of the ecosystem we all depend on. For many of the species covered by the Raptor MOU, reintroduction or reinforcement programs have become a critical tool in the fight against their decline. And the Raptor MOU brings together signatories, cooperating partners from Africa and Eurasia in a shared commitment to the conservation of migratory birds of species, birds of prey. And as a coordinating unit of the MOU, our main mission is to support partners with knowledge, with tools, with guidance that can translate concrete action on the ground. And this report is a direct expression of this commitment and mandate, and we hope it will serve as a practical resource to help government, academias, NGOs to learn from each other, align their approaches, strengthen collaboration across borders to support the conservation of migratory raptors. I want to take a moment here to thank my fellow co-authors, two of which are here, one and Konica, who have been instrumental in developing on this document. But a very important thank you goes to all the experts who have shared their knowledge, their data, their first-hand insight, and expertise with us. The individuals mentioned in this report are only a fraction of the many, many people involved in each project. And I say that very carefully, recognizing that one of the things this report really makes very clear is that successful reintroduction is never a work of few individuals. It's very much a work of teams, of institutions, communities, and partnership working for many years and lasting, in many cases, for decades. Which brings to what is the most important message probably on this publication, which is there are no quick fixes. Releasing a few birds back into nature is not a solution. It may be a starting point, but the programs that have been successful are those that have built on rigorous feasibility studies. This is very important. Effective threat mitigation. The threats are still there. We are not going anywhere. Long-term monitoring. We need to understand how successful or not we are on the things we are doing. Community engagement, because we need to have the local population accepting the project, and even more important, probably sustainable, or as important, sustainable and stable funding, because of conservation is an expensive exercise. Those that have struggled often, the projects that are not as successful because at least one of these pillars has been missing. Another point I want to make very clear here is this report does not replace the IUCN guidelines of reintroduction. They remain our gold standard and reference for any decision to pursue or not a reintroduction or reinforcement program. Our aim in this program, on this project, was simply to gather lessons from the field, bring them together in one place and share with everybody. So I added to the IUCN guidelines, not thinking to replace for a second. But now let's look at what is the contents of the report, and I will leave the word now to Juan and to Konica. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion later on when we will have a panel discussion with Des Thompson, Jovan Mandevsky, Munir, Virani, and Volen Arkumaren, which are one of the few of the many people we interview. So thank you very much. Juan, the floor is yours. I need to unmute you, sorry. Yeah, now is yours. You can unmute yourself now, Juan.
Okay, hello. Yeah, you can hear me, right? Okay.
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, so thank you, Umberto, and thank you, everyone. So firstly, let me introduce myself a little bit. I'm the former intern working together with Umberto, and I'm very happy to share my experience supporting the early stages of this report. So this report was developed as part of the Raptors MOU work plan, and I had a chance to contribute to this task during my internship with the Raptors MOU in Abu Dhabi, and the task was started in 2024. So working together with my colleague Pierluigi and under the guidance of Umberto and Lauren, we started by developing an initial report structure and an interview guide. So this was done very quick as the context of the report was clearly defined. This report is to gather practical lessons from Raptor Reintroduction and reinforcement programs across the Raptors MOU region and make those cases more accessible to conservation practitioners and decision makers. And so once the initial structure was in place, we began identifying experts and potential case studies. And we reached out to members of the technical advisory group and then expanded our network through recommendations from interviewees and colleagues working in the field. Over to the next slide, please. Yeah, so as you can see, this is our interview guide. We send this guide to interviewees and to gather their feedbacks. And much of our works focused on contacting experts, arranging interviews across different countries and time zones, distributing questionnaires of interviews were not possible, and organizing the information we received into a consistent format. So we reached out to members of the technical advisory group and then expanded our network through recommendations from interviewees and colleagues working in the field. Before the end of my internship, we had completed a number of interviews, assembled much of the material that formed the foundation of the report. So the work was then continued by Konica and the wider Raptors MOU team, and leading to the publication being presented today. And I would like to thank all experts who generously shared their time and their experience with us. Their contributions were essential to this project. So thank you. And so, Konica, the stage is yours. And Konica will give more details about this report.
Thank you so much, Yuan. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. Before I move into more detailed findings of the report, I would like to say a massive thank you to all our valuable contributors for this report. Your insights and your expertise really did help shape up this report. So thank you all very much. Also, a special thank you to Yuan and Pierre for building up this foundation for the report. And last but definitely not the least, to Umberto for his support and guidance throughout this entire process. So thank you all. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yes. So the report overall looks into the programs across Europe and Asia. And as you can see from the table on these slides, that these programs, they span across different timelines, some of them over 5 years, while the others have been ongoing for more than decades. The financial scale also varies from small scale funds to multi-million-dollar investments. So the funding models in these programs, they really relied heavily on a blend from government environmental grants, from contributions from the international NGOs, and also having funding mechanisms like the European Union LIFE program. So these were the blended models that most of these programs used. So this sort of diversity, it allowed us to understand how the project scale, it impacts the overall conservation viability. Next slide, please. Can we have the next slide, please?
You should see. Can you see it?
Yeah, the next slide, yes.
This one?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Bert. So to successfully return these raptors back into the nature, there were tailored methodologies that these programs used, and one of the most commonly used was wild hacking. In this, the chicks were placed in artificial nests, and they were fed using hidden hatches and puppet systems. So as you can see here in the picture, it's a hand glove puppet, which is of Egyptian vultures being used to feed the young chick. And this was done strictly to prevent human imprinting. So once they reached the fledging age, these structures were opened and they were gradually dispersed into the wild. For soft release and delayed release, the birds were held in large aviaries and they were at the release site sometimes up to months, sometimes even up to in a year. And this was done so that they get well adapted to the local climate in the region, also help them build those important flight muscles and as well as interact with the wild populations in the surroundings. Third is fostering, where the captive bred chicks they were inserted into wild nests to be raised by wild foster parents. Now, implementing these programs does require a multi-layered stakeholder network. So these programs brought together scientists and field experts, the national government ministries, international conservation bodies like RSPB and local NGOs as well, and most importantly, the local communities. So, for example, one of the programs in Scotland established the Moffat Golden Eagle Festival, which brought together the community support and also gave way to ecotourism in the region. So the picture here is from the festival in 2021, and it shows a live display of the trained falconry. There were also other supports from other stakeholders like national electricity companies. So they stepped up as partners in terms of insulating those power lines. And also pro bono support was offered from the military in the project where they helped in sourcing the chicks from Norway to the UK. Next slide, please. So these programs, they also face some setbacks, which we can group them as following. So biologically, there were disruptions from avian pox and influenza outbreaks. So this disrupted the timelines of the project, and infrastructurally, power line execution, which is still one of the leading cause of bird mortality in most of the regions. So modern renewable energy conflicts like the expanding wind farms, which cause direct turbine collision and also affect the habitat of these birds in these areas. For example, in southern Italy, the Egyptian vulture population, they faced high juvenile mortality. And since this was a migratory population, even though the local threats were minimized in terms of insulating the pylons, there was still high juvenile mortality as they faced electrocution from the uninsulated pylons that they encountered along the migratory path. And socially, myths and misconceptions against these raptors, they persist. For instance, the white-tailed eagles, they were wrongfully blamed by the sheep farmers for causing the lamb deaths, even though in reality it was poor animal husbandry which led to the death of the lambs. Were still and finally, administrative strains, which consist of the budget constraint, operational delays, and combining this with all these slow biological timelines, it did trigger public confusion in some of the regions, and this also caused social conflicts in the areas. So overall, what this proved that threat mitigation is absolutely necessary before any releases took place in the wild. Next slide, please. So the overall outcomes, they highlight significant milestones in the raptor conservation. Major achievements, they include the establishment of self-sustaining wild breeding populations, and also their expansion to their historical geographic ranges across Europe. So to highlight, in Bulgaria, the first falcon population of Egyptian vulture increased in 40 years. Um, can we move to the next slide, please? Another important and highly successful program, which is the Red Kite Reintroduction program in the UK. They recorded nearly 1,000 birds, which were released across 9 sites between 1989 and 2013. So these were some of the most remarkable achievements from these programs. Next slide, please. So we also examined a case study from the Netherlands, which provides a very fascinating alternative approach to natural recolonization. So instead of launching active reintroduction programs in the late 1990s, the Dutch conservationists, they opted to wait for the neighboring raptor population to expand naturally. So the proposals were there for reintroducing white-tailed eagles, but it was rejected in favor of natural migration from Germany and Poland. So the first breeding pair, which came in 2006, it increased to over 45 pairs, and this was driven by having matured forests and also the availability of prey such as geese. In the case of red kites and peregrine falcons, both of these species also self-recolonized in the landscape, and their recovery was fueled by the ban in organochlorine pesticides, strict enforcement against the illegal persecution, and also from the population spillover from Belgium and Germany. So in the Netherlands, instead of engaging in expensive active translocations, the focus was entirely on strict habitat protection and minimizing or removing those threats. So because the healthy neighboring populations, they existed, the raptors were able to naturally return and reestablish themselves on their own. And this also allowed the conservationists to redirect that heavy funding from captive breeding and move it towards large-scale habitat improvement, which again ultimately did benefit a wide variety of species. So successful natural recovery is a multi-layered effort, and it calls for strong government support, having strict anti-poisoning enforcement, citizen science monitoring networks, and also calls for comprehensive multi-year feasibility studies to be done in order to determine whether a landscape is ecologically and socially ready for natural recovery or not. So overall, this case study teaches us a fundamental lesson that active translocation, yes, it is a very powerful tool, but there are also other alternatives. If the nearby populations are stable, investing our resources into the habitat health and removing or minimizing those threats, it can allow nature to successfully heal itself and bring back those raptors in increasing numbers. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we can distill our findings into key factors that carry a successful reintroduction. Our policy recommendations from the report, they're also in line with these key success factors. So firstly, science-based methodologies which are tailored to the species ecology. And as Umberto initially mentioned, that conservation success really heavily depends on choosing that right methodologies that matches these biological traits, the social structures, the developmental stages of these raptors. And this can be achieved by following the guidelines which are set by IUCN, also the AWA guidelines, as they will make sure that there's effective and ethical implementation of these projects. Second, threat mitigation before release is also very important, since most of the threats, they come from non-conservation sectors like energy and transport. So there must be active engagement with the external stakeholders. This could either mean working with the power utilities in against electrocution and insulating those power lines, or it could also be with land use planners like wind farms to protect those nesting habitats. Um, Long-term investment in pre and post-release monitoring is also very important, since these programs, they must back their ecological methodologies with investments in these tracking tools. So it could be satellite telemetry or flyway mapping or geofencing, as continuous monitoring will give us that data which is needed for adaptive management. And because the real world conditions, they constantly change, monitoring outcomes, they may require the projects to adjust their methods or their timelines and targets accordingly. And having this sort of data-driven approach will allow the teams to implement those changes in real time. And at the same time, it will also help prevent any major losses that can be prevented through monitoring. Community engagement and stakeholder is also very important. To highlight one of the programs, the South of Scotland Golden Eagle Project and the UK Red Kite program, they hired specialist officers who work directly with the farmers and foresters and the gamekeepers. This was the group which was very much against raptor conservation. So having these officers as a trusted point of contact between the project teams and these groups, it sort of helped prevent the minor concerns from turning into major conflicts. So by hosting open days, sharing the information transparently, this sort of helped dissolve that generational mistrust that was there in these regions. And also engaging stakeholders can be a way to create financial incentives. So the creation of the Red Kite Trail in Scotland, it turned raptor protection into an ecotourism revenue, which motivated the local businesses in the area like hotels and the cafes and the pubs to financially support the trail in exchange for promotion as kite-friendly establishments. And similarly, as I previously mentioned, the Morford Golden Eagle Festival, this became both an educational event as well as an ecotourism attraction that supported the local economy in the region. Communication and education is also very important to have that long-term success. The programs must bridge that critical gap between national and regional capacity. This, of course, requires having those multidisciplinary teams, which are supported by collaborative training between the governments and the NGOs. And public education can also be important in terms of dismantling those historical myths and misinformation against raptors, which can be addressed through public outreach, delivering activities in communities or presentations in schools and universities and so on. So again, as mentioned before, conservation must be integrated into broader policy frameworks. This could include the national action plans or even like landscape level restoration initiatives, because having this sort of cross-sector policy coherence will make sure that there is a formal legal recognition which aligns with the project's targets as well. And at the same time, it will also help ensure that there is a long-term institutional backing for the project. Lastly, secure long-term multi-source funding to sustain these full life cycle of these initiatives, because most of these programs, they expand for decades. Governments and like international donors should explore more blended finance models. Now, this could be either including conservation trust funds or going towards ecotourism revenues. So overall, there is a critical need for long-term planning, transparent communication, early stakeholder engagement, and whether it is addressing these public misconceptions or managing ecological impacts. These programs and projects, they have shown us that conservation success is yes, it is about the biology of the species involved, but it is also equally about the people, the trust, and the persistence that is needed to carry these programs. So while reinforcement and reintroduction, they are the tools to bring back these raptor populations. Looking into natural recovery, given that there is proper habitat management and threat minimization, it can lead to healthy raptor populations in regions. But in case if natural recovery is not an option, then reintroductions and reinforcements, if well planned and embedded into broader strategies, these programs can contribute to the conservation outcomes of raptors. So on that note, I would like to move into our panel discussion, which will focus on the structural realities of these programs. And I would like to hand it over to Umberto to open the floor and introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Konika and Juan. Of course, I invite everybody to read actually the entire report and to go today to the link that has been shared before. As always happened yesterday, we realized there were some typos, so we modified a bit the text. So if you have downloaded, please re-downloaded the version that is online at the same link today. But that doesn't changes anything in the report itself. But I think this the version it is now online is the correct one. Panel discussion. I'm very pleased to have here the panelists for heroes of raptor conservation. Let me start introducing Des Thompson, which is a distinguished raptor research and conservationist. It's very difficult to summarize his long career and key role in the Raptor MOU. He was really at the center in shaping and establishing in 2007-2009 the Raptor MOU, and since then he has been sitting in the technical advisory group of the Raptor MOU itself, who he chaired between 2009 and 2023. So we have really the most experienced raptor conservation. Currently is emeritus fellow at the Leverhule at the Environmental Research Institute in the UK. We have then Jovan Andesky. He is in the mind and the soul behind many of the vulture conservation projects in the Balkan Peninsula. And from there, he moved to Spain to be the conservation director of the Vulture Conservation Foundation. And he's, among other things, also the inspirators and promoter of the Wildlife Crime Academy, building capacity of police forces to address wildlife crime in Europe, the Mediterranean, and Africa, and soon probably in other parts of the world. Munir Virani, another person who's very difficult to summarize in 3 lines, has a long history of developing and implementing raptor conservation, first of all in his native Africa, but then he expanded work in Asia, addressing the vulture collapse in the early 2000s, then more recently moved to the Americas and working with the Peregrine Fund there for several years, and is now based in Abu Dhabi as a chief operating officer of the Mohammed bin Zayed Raptor Conservation Fund. Last but not least, we have Volen Akumarev, which is the recipient of the European Early Career Conservation Award 2025, provided by the European section of the Society for Conservation Biology. He's the coordinator of the Egyptian vulture restocking program in Bulgaria and works full-time for the Bulgarian Society for the Protection of Birds. So thank you very much, all of you, to be here with us today and to share your experience as you did already in the report. I will start with the question for Munir, and is looking at the cases which is suddenly very often where the national economic development directly clashes with the ongoing or planned reintroduction projects, for example, with the development of wind farms or electric grid in an area that is actually will be the target for reintroduction. So what are the mechanisms, structural or institutional, that can be introduced to ensure cooperation between ministries rather than letting environmental goals being overridden by the so-called overriding public interest? Munir, can you shed some light in that?
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me, and good afternoon.
Well.
Great. Thank you, Umberto, for organizing this excellent webinar, and also to the previous speakers for a very comprehensive overview of the report. Thank you for the question, because I think it gets to the real fault line in raptor conservation today. And the honest answer is that in most countries that I've worked in, environmental goals, they don't get overridden in a single dramatic moment, right? They get overridden quietly, they get overridden much earlier, because when you talk about conservation, it arrives at the planning table way after the route, way after the permit, and the budgets have already been decided. So the question isn't really how do we win the argument once it starts, it's how do we make sure that the argument happens at a stage when the outcome can still change. So from my experience across multiple regions, I'd like to point out to 4 structural mechanisms that I believe can actually shift the balance. The first one is really about moving biodiversity upstream into the spatial planning law itself. So for example, in Bulgaria, the sensitivity mapping work that has been done around Egyptian vulture and griffon vulture corridors became part of the wind energy permitting process, right? This is not advisory. A developer cannot apply for a permit in a designated Raptor sensitivity zone without triggering a different track of assessment. And that single shift, by putting the map before the project, really changes the conservation from confrontation to siting. Our work in Mongolia gives us a very similar lesson with Seika falcons, where electrocution on distribution lines was severe enough that something really had to change, right? And what worked was a hybrid model. The Mongolian government amended its national standard for power distribution lines in September of 2021 to explicitly include bird safety measures, creating a legal requirement to address electrocution risk. And that was an agreement between the Mohammed bin Zayed Raptor Conservation Fund and the Mongolia's Ministry of Environment, then helped facilitate the large-scale retrofitting, in which now, as of today, 28,016 poles have been insulated under that partnership. So what happened is that regulation set the floor and the partnership developed the work, or delivered the work. And here's what's interesting. The energy companies have actually thanked us for insulating these poles because power outages have virtually disappeared. They spend far fewer man hours responding to faults. There is no loss of revenue, and there's a significant feel-good factor that they are now looking to leverage at the upcoming UN COP17 on desertification, which Mongolia is hosting. But before I move on to the second mechanism, I want to flag something here because I think it really matters. Retrofitting has become a thriving business. And like any business, prices vary enormously. A US or a European supplier will typically charge $300, $400, $500 per insulated pole. Equipment, on the other hand, that is manufactured in China, that includes transport, can come in at around $50 a pole. So for a country trying to retrofit thousands of power lines, that is the difference between a project that happens at scale and one that really stalls after the first 100 poles. So the governments themselves need safeguards. They need procurement frameworks that ensure that they're getting the best value for their money with verified quality standards so that the goal remains free-flying birds and not a few suppliers that are profiting from a recurring conservation problem. And that is the alignment we should be aiming for when the business case and the biodiversity case point in the same direction. And really, the conservation stops being about trade-offs and starts being about shared wins. The second mechanism I want to talk about is statutory cross-ministerial bodies with actual decision-making authority, not coordination committees that meet once or twice a year and produce a communique. And from my experience in Kenya, that illustrates exactly why this matters. You take Kipeto Wind Energy Farm, for example. The government had already allocated that site for 65 turbines. And that site sat within the flight path and literally just 15 kilometers from the largest and most important breeding colony of critically endangered Rupel's vultures in Kenya, around 250 individuals at any one time. Birds were going to die. There's no question about it. So the win-win came down to a relationship. The then CEO happened to be a conservation he happened to be conservation minded. He was the son of a respected Serengeti warden, and we engaged. Thanks to a chance encounter on a golf course. Again, that's a whole different topic altogether. He offered a funding mechanism to tackle the real driver of vulture declines in Kenya, which is really retaliatory poisoning. And that intervention seems to be working so far. But if you contrast that with Lake Turkana wind energy, for example, in northern Kenya, that operates in silo, completely cut off from the conservation community. And we may never, ever know how many birds die there, right in the middle of a huge migratory pathway. 2 wind farms, 2 different models, and the difference between them came down to the personal behavior of one executive. Now, that cannot be how a country protects its critically endangered species. So the onus has to fall on a cross-ministerial committee to ensure that energy is produced sustainably without driving biodiversity loss, particularly of threatened species. Now, I want to be very clear about our role. This is not a position of comfort with wind energy being built in sensitive areas. It is not. Where a site threatens a critically endangered species, our first responsibility is to challenge it through every legal and procedural channel that's available and to argue for it to be sited somewhere else. And we should be very clear-eyed that this can work. Look at the Mannar Strait, for example, in Sri Lanka. I was there a couple of months ago. This is the southernmost point of the Central Asian Flyway. It is a critical site for migratory raptors and waterbirds. The Adani Group has signed an agreement to build 52 turbines there. The Wildlife and Nature Protection Society took it to the Supreme Court. A separate fundamental rights petition challenged the EIA, and the scientific community spoke out publicly. The project was withdrawn early last year, and when the government pursued a smaller state-run alternative, the EIA process rejected 12 of the 21 proposed turbines on ecological grounds. That is sensitivity mapping doing exactly what it should, scaling a project down rather than killing a flyway. But when all of these avenues have been exhausted and a project is going to proceed regardless, we as conservationists have an obligation to minimize these losses. The third mechanism is regulatory assurance for the private sector. The Texas Aplomato Falcon program is one of the clearest examples I've had the privilege of being associated with. That program would have not worked without safe harbor agreements, which gave Texan ranchers the legal certainty that hosting an endangered species would definitely not constrain their land use in the future. That single instrument unlocked private land at a scale government land alone could never have provided. And the Dominican Republic's critically endangered Ridgway's hawk dispersal in Punta Cana also reinforces the same lesson, with a tourism developer that was brought in as a formal partner rather than just a goodwill sponsor. When private actors carry development risk, conservation has to offer them a predictable framework, not just an appeal to the right thing. And the final mechanism is what I believe is financing that is based on conditions. Multilateral development banks, sovereign green bonds, and increasingly commercial lenders are attaching biodiversity safeguards to infrastructure financing. When a wind farm's financing depends on demonstrating compliance with a national Raptor sensitivity protocol, then the Ministry of Energy starts caring about raptors very quickly. This is probably the most underused lever that we have. And underpinning all 4 of these mechanisms, I want to point out to a 5th one, which I want to make, which is institutional. And that is exactly where the CMS and specifically the Raptors MOU can play a far more architectural role than it currently does. The CMS framework already, to its credit, brings range states to the same table. And what it should be doing more forcefully is requiring signatories to develop, to maintain, and to regularly update national Raptor sensitivity maps, and to embed those maps in their energy and infrastructure planning process. We know raptors don't respect borders. A Seika falcon that breeds in Bulgaria might die on a Sudanese power line, or an Egyptian vulture that's released in Spain might be poisoned in Niger. So the Raptors MOU has this convening authority. What we need now is for it to use that authority to make sensitivity mapping perhaps a standing obligation of membership and not just an optional good practice. So to bring it all together, I think the answer to forced alignment is not better conversation between ministries. What we really need is a legal architecture in which biodiversity is a procedural requirement of development and not a competing interest to development. Sensitivity mapping in law, statutory bodies with binding authority, regulatory assurance for private sectors, conditionality in finance, and above all of that, a stronger CMS Raptors MOU that's pushing range states to act with consistency across the flyway. None of these require a country to choose between economic growth and raptors. What they require is the choice to be made before we pour the concrete, and definitely not after the first bird is killed. With that, thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Munir, and message heard and received. I can say that, well, the Raptor MOU is working in that direction. Well, CMS is working in the direction to the Energy Task Force. The Raptor MOU has identified 7,000 sites, which are important, recognized by CMS now after COP15 as international important Raptors areas, which is areas that need to be protected for the raptors, so therefore also looking at energy infrastructure impact across Africa and Eurasia. And actually this concept has been uploaded and uplifted at global level by the parties. So they really like the idea of looking at port, but also they are been working on sensitivity mapping like AVI-STEP and so on. So yeah, there is a lot of work to be done. The direction is there, is clear, but I think your summarize has been very, very useful and informative. Thank you for that. This presentation, by the way, is being registered, will be recorded, so it will be then available for other people if you want to look again at your contribution, which is very elaborate. So thank you very much for this. Now let's move to Jovan Andesky, and I'd like to ask you something about the fact that, well, reintroduction and or translocation projects are expensive projects, but that we know that. But there's sometimes the financial liquidity has issues, and for example, hiring social scientists or funding targeted capacity training seems to be less important or falls between the cracks of the finance limitation. You have been running a lot of live projects in many parts of Europe. So when a project is trapped in this resource limitation, what funding mechanism can be used to build these capacities without draining the core budget needed for the survival of raptors?
Thank you, Umberto. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share some of my practical experience in reintroduction projects, basically mostly related in my working experience with vultures. I just want to give a kind of a brief introduction related to the vulture introduction projects, just to make sure that everybody understands how big projects they are and what we are talking about. If we take, for example, one of the first reintroduction projects initiated in Europe, starting in the 80s, it was the Griffon vulture introduction in France. France lost all vulture species in the 60s. Then initiated a reintroduction project in the 80s, and then in the 90s, they even reintroduced the cinereus vulture. So as you all know, France currently have the 4 vulture species, and they are with a positive trend. Egyptian vulture came back as well by themselves. On the other part of the Europe, it was initiated also in the 80s, the bearded vulture introduction project in the Alps. So 4 countries, joint effort. That project is still up and running. So we are talking about, 45 years or maybe 50 years of intensive program of captive breeding and releasing of bearded vultures in the Alps. Currently, there is over 55 breeding pairs in the Alps. So this is just want to say that we are talking about massive effort, we are talking about long-term effort, and we are talking about serious financial investments. and real commitment from authorities and conservationists. I know in nature conservation, budget is a limiting factor, but when we are talking about reintroduction projects, particularly those reintroduction projects that are crucial and needed for not only for returning a species in a territory, but also to provide a future for a global distribution of the species, connecting populations that are isolated. In that case, I think that funding cannot be a limiting factor. And although I will go back to the reality, but I would really not want to consider a reintroduction project as a low budget conservation project. Everybody should be aware that whenever a reintroduction project is initiated, that this requires a serious commitment of partners, particularly not only from partners and conservationists. We should not forget that protected species, raptors, or any species, if we talk in general, they're natural heritage of the country. In democratic society, we select governments. So the government is the ultimate responsible for initiating or finalizing a project. Therefore, my kind advice is that whenever we think about reintroduction project, that this project must be supported by the government, and the government should provide a security and guarantee that this project is implemented until the end. You will see in the report is mentioned the IUCN guidelines for translocation of animals and reintroductions. Therefore, this is one of the criteria, is the commitment with the authorities and commitment with budget. Because the reintroduction projects are not only breeding or releasing birds in the wild. Reintroduction project must consider mitigation of threats. And when we talk about mitigation of threats, this is a bit a tricky part, because in terms of funding, releasing of birds or manipulation of birds, it's normally considered as attractive activity for donors. And probably, as we compare with other conservation actions, it's easier to secure budget of actual release of birds, because this is something that politicians like, this is something that is attractive for the media, for the general public, and normally you can secure some funding for the actual releases of the birds. But reintroduction project cannot be considered if it's not accompanied by threat mitigation measures. We see that it's much more difficult to secure funding to mitigate threats. Munir get a very, very nice overview of the electrocution and collision. That looks that there is a big potential for a budget, considering electricity company, particularly in Spain, it works well. Basically, electricity companies are generously contributing in mitigation process. But when we are talking about poisoning with poison baits, it's one of the major threats for vultures. Like, please trust me that mitigating poisoning or fighting poisoning or creating or solving conflicts with livestock breeders and with hunters, this is not an attractive measure that many funders would like to fund. Therefore, my kind advice is that let's try to do everything possible not to find ourselves in a situation if funding is missing when project is in implementing stage, because reintroduction project it's a serious action. It's probably one of the most difficult conservation actions to be implemented. On the end, reintroduction project is only successful if it's finalized. Being finalized means is creating a viable population in the nature and accomplish the mission that you had to connect populations and to give sustainability to this species. And there is also another important factor to be considered. There is the issue of animal welfare. So these kind of projects cannot be lacking money or funding to continue. I've seen experiences, bad experiences, or not so positive experiences, when birds are kept without no reason, when birds are kept in not a good condition simply because funding was not available. We should be extremely careful with that, because this is creating a conflict or possible conflicts with other legislations, for example, the animal welfare. So let's all try to agree that raptor reintroduction or reintroduction of any species is a serious measure. We need the the agreement or the support from the authorities. We need to make sure all these IUCN guidelines that are commonly mentioned whenever we are talking about reintroduction, and it, make sure that they are implemented. Make sure that these become a guidelines that is used by the governmental authorities as well, and they're really committed to implement them. And one of them, as I mentioned previously, is securing a long-term funding and make sure that the project that is initiated can be finalized with a good success. And let's also not exclude threat mitigation measures that should go back to back with any reintroduction project, so that we make sure that the project is successful. I also, I want to use my minutes to highlight another issue. I do see, a part of the funding, I do see another possible complication with the reintroduction project. That reintroduction projects are sometimes considered as attractive actions, and there is no international way to coordinate this, to implement them and to make sure that we do them in places where it's extremely necessary for the species that we are targeting. There is no international control. We have been in a vulture introduction for many years, and we see the only way that, to kind of provide coordination, not to lead, but actually to make sure that, there is a balance and these projects are implemented where it's really needed, is to limit the access of funding, to convince people to work in network and have a common understanding on priorities. The Vulture Multi-Species Action Plan is an excellent document that actually, from it, you can highly see what are the priorities for which vulture species and where the focus should be put. So that's a nice way to coordinate things. And then another method is with the availability of the birds. So this can be also a thing that I don't want to use the word controlling, but it's to make sure that everybody understands where are the priorities for the target species that we are targeting. Thank you so much. I'm here to be part of the discussion or answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jovan. Your expertise has been very useful, and thank you again to share your long expertise on this. Let me now ask Volen about his take on the Dutch case study, where there really a very clear analysis of where it makes sense or not to do reintroduction, and what were the elements that brought the decision to actually do reintroduction or reinforcement, in this case, of Egyptian vultures in Bulgaria, and what is your experience on that, Volen? Volen, are you still there? We might have run into connection issues. No, hold on. Maybe, yeah, we should be able to talk. Volen, you're muted. You need to unmute yourself.
He wrote that you need to unmute him. It might be a rights issue.
Okay, let me apologize for that. No, he's disabled, so he's able, so he should be able to do it. Let me try again. So apologies for that. Try now, Volen. You're still muted. Oh, that's a technical issue. Apologies for that. While you try to solve that one, let me move to the question for Des. I want to look to you at an element that has been particularly significant in projects in the UK. So relying on ecotourism revenues to fund long-term monitoring sounds a very good idea, and it is, in fact. But of course, leads or expose the projects to vulnerability of global economy, shocks, pandemics, we saw that a few years back, or shifting travel trends. So how can a project diversify its funding to ensure baseline activities like veterinary cares or tracking do not collapse when the tourism, for example, drops?
Okay, thanks, Umberto, and many thanks, Konica and the team, congratulations on a great report. I'm really mindful we're really pushed for time. So this is a great question. And I tend to think of this as a three-legged stool. Success really rests on ecotourism, diversification, and resilience. So really, in order to secure a sound future for our programme, for its monitoring and the health of the animals, we need to first anticipate what lies ahead and have a risk register properly equipped to deal with the worst of shocks. And cutting to the chase on this, resilience is really the key to success, and frankly often overlooked. And Berta, you mentioned the COVID pandemic, and this really showed the utter importance of resilience. And we need to have in play a programme of work which covers strong governance, robust monitoring, clear communications, and the health of the animal populations. And reflecting on this and reflecting on the work I've personally been involved in with reinforcing the golden eagle population in the south of Scotland, I think it's so important we invest heavily in deep community engagement. This really offers local, regional, and indeed national support for diverse funding and thereby securing local and indeed national government support. And we've been very fortunate in the UK to have both Scottish Government and UK Government support for our work. And actually there's a very good paper on this, on resilience, if you're interested. There's a journal called Tourism Planning and Development, and a team led by Natjana Meyer has published, based in Johannesburg, have published a paper really around this issue of resilience and the importance of community engagement. So we're pushed for time. I'll stop at that, but I'll put the link to the paper in the chat.
Thank you very much, Des. Very looking forward to read that paper, and thank you for your expertise. Let's see if we have, in the meantime, resolved the problems of Volen. Are you there? So in the meantime, there are other people joining the last moment. Can you talk now? No, you're still... Okay, let me allow you again. Try to unmute you. Oh, this is very unfortunate. We cannot sort it out. Well, what we can do, I'm really sorry for this technical issue. I don't think we can solve it now. Oh, here you are. Fantastic.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Okay, so going back to the question, just to refresh your memory, everybody's memory, is about looking at the dash case. What is different basically between why the decision in the Netherlands were not taken in Bulgaria, and what are the elements you consider for going for a restocking, in fact, or a reinforcement project in Bulgaria?
Yes, thank you, Umberto, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to see so many people attending this workshop. Yes, indeed, it is very crucial when a reintroduction or translocation project is intended to start, to have the very good background information and to really know in depth why the population reached to a state that was extinct from an area or is in a bad state and needs to be supplemented with individuals from captivity. That goes back to exactly what Jovan said before. It's a very expensive endeavor to start such a program, and it's a long-term commitment. So in order to be sure that such a commitment and such action is going to be successful, you really need to know to know the roots of the problems and to have mitigated the threats, so that you actually start a program that have a very high chance to be successful. And in the case with the Egyptian vulture in Bulgaria that was declining for over 30 years, we had quite a good data and background data, and knew what is the situation with the population and the long-term trend of the population, showing that despite the conservation efforts being implemented to mitigate the threats at the local level, like insulation of power lines or working against poaching and poison use, the population is still on decline. So when we started the flyway project for the Egyptian vulture, this was one of the most important things, is actually to work at a larger scale and ensure that the survival of the individuals is going to be improved. At the same time, it is very important to have a scientific analysis and population viability analysis that we have performed in our case in order to see how the conservation efforts put in place are actually going to have influence on the population before you take the decision to start an active reintroduction or translocation. And in our case, it showed, the population viability analysis showed that actually without a release of birds, we are going to lose the population in the next 20 years. So in our case, alongside, we had these two pillars of the population, of the conservation strategy. One is still continue mitigating the threats, not only locally, but along the flyway in order to improve the survival of these species, but at the same time supplement the population with birds, captive bred birds that are released in the wild, in order to ensure that the population is going to sustain long enough in order to mitigate the threats and ensure that the population could start recovering by itself. So it's a very hard decision, and in order to be sure that you take the good decision, you actually need to step on a solid data. And that's why these long-term monitoring efforts for vulture and raptor populations that are undergoing in some cases for over 40 years provide this crucial data that can inform your conservation strategies. And yeah, that's a really short answer to your question, but I see that we are running out of time, so I'm gonna simply stop here.
Thank you very much, Bora. In fact, the knowledge and the level of understanding of the problems in Bulgaria were very deep. And of course, the situation in Bulgaria was completely different from the Netherlands. We're talking a species which was declining for long terms, as opposed to species which were all around and growing. So of course, there are very different considerations to be considered, on top of all the others that your other panelists have highlighted in these few minutes. I want to thank, first of all, our panelists for this very interesting contribution. I want to thank all the people who have been providing their interviews, and also to my co-authors for Konica and Yuan for writing this report, and all of you. There were almost 100 people attending this workshop, and I hope you had learned something today. This presentation, as I said, this meeting will be recorded, so will be available in a few days' time on our website. So if you want to look at that, and maybe we'll just try to do a summary of the contribution from the panelists.